Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
We always think of the villains in stories, movies, the news as being an other from us. We're not like them. They're separate. They're evil, as opposed to recognizing how close we are to being just like them.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 32, where we edge ever closer to my actual age. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or have authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Michael Nye about his book, All the Castles Burned. Michael Nye is the author of two books, the story collection Strategies Against Extinction and the novel All the Castles Burned. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in American Literary Review, Boulevard, Cincinnati Review, Crab Orchard Review, Epic, Hobart, Kenyon Review, and The Normal School, among many others. He lives in Columbus, Ohio. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Read, Learn, Live. My name is John Monaster, and I am your host. And I am here today with Michael Nye to talk about his book, All the Castles Burned. And I'm showing this off to Michael so he can see. I've got all my little tabs here where I marked up his excellent book. This is quite a story, so I'm really excited to talk with Michael about it. But I really like to start off with a hello. So, hello, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself, John?
I'm also doing well. But yeah, why don't you just go ahead and give us a quick intro and summarize the book for us?
Sure. So, All the Castles Burned is my debut novel. It's the story of Owen Webb. He's a freshman who has just been accepted to an elite prep school in Cincinnati circa 1994. And he falls in with a upperclassman named Carson Bly, who's a mysterious boy who's from a wealthier family who seems to exist in a world different from all the other boys at this elite prep school. And through a love of basketball, the boys bond, become close, and Carson more than takes Owen under his wing, but begins in subtle ways to manipulate and shape their friendship. At the same time, Owen's parents have a marriage that is falling apart. They're a working class family, and the stress of their marriage is beginning to show cracks. And over the course of this year where Owen is a freshman at this school, his father is arrested for a surprising crime. And Owen realizes that he doesn't know his father or his mother particularly well at all. Because of this crime, because of this trauma, Owen grows even closer to Carson, who continues to manipulate the younger boy and really shape their friendship towards a direction of darkness and violence that I think is unsettling and unexpected and intriguing. And that is the elevator pitch for what this novel is all about.
There you go. And that's a great one. And yeah, wow. This took a lot of twists and turns, I think, and it was really exciting to read. I read it pretty quickly, but pretty thoroughly, I think. So, I always like to start off with just some kind of background creative writing process questions. That stuff's pretty interesting to me. And then we'll hop into kind of the, what's actually going on in the book. But just to start off with, what was your writing process like? How did you go from the idea or inspiration from this book to the finished element?
Yeah, it's an idea that's been percolating for 20 years. Owen's father is actually based on my own, a very similar situation where a seemingly normal middle-class father has a double life. So almost 25 years ago now, what happened to Owen in this book happened to me, where My father, who I thought was one person, turned out to be someone completely different. The rest of the book is entirely fiction. So I like to say up front that there is no Carson. There
Hmm.
is no Caitlin, who is Carson's sister in this novel. And I certainly was not that good of a basketball player. So looking back at my writing over the last 20 years, I took my very first creative writing workshop when I was an undergraduate at Ohio State. And the very first story I wrote in that class was about an adult man going to visit his father in prison.
Hmm.
And I have, in many ways, been writing a version of that story ever since. I published a short story collection back in 2012, and I was flipping through the book semi recently and was surprised to discover that I have been writing about fathers and sons in some kind of fictive way for a very long time. And
Hmm.
so that part of the story has been something I've been working on really as long as I've been a writer. As for the book itself specifically, I think I started writing it about 4 years ago. I had another novel that I finished that I got an agent for, and we never sold it. And during the time that former agent was circulating my book and trying to find a publisher for it, I began writing this story that ultimately became All the Castles Burned. And it was a story about prep school and male friendship and violence, um, and started working in coffee shops. I, at the time, lived in Columbia, Missouri, and there was a particular table at the back of the shop. I'd always try to get there at 6 a.m. when they opened and work at that back table for 2.5, 3 hours before I had to go to work. I've long been a person that typed up my work on a laptop, but recently, within the last year or so, I've tried to handwrite everything that I do rather than type
Hmm.
everything up.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a very different creative process, which is slower, but I think more fruitful. And I'm also a big believer in printing out my drafts and then writing in the margins. I do a lot of my editing on print with blue ink, so I probably have all 8 or 9 drafts of this novel in stacks of paper somewhere. Um, and I will leave it at that.
Sounds good. Yeah, that's really interesting to me that you switched to writing by hand because, like you said, that's a big difference. Was there anything specifically that kind of precipitated that switch?
Yeah, a writer friend on Twitter made the suggestion to start writing by hand.
Hmm.
I find that even with the best self-control, it's really difficult to focus when you can see a clock in the bottom of your screen, when the internet is one click away. Even if you think you're just going to take a look for 5 minutes or quickly check your email, it's very, very easy to lose 15, 20 minutes. And one of the things I've discovered when writing by hand is those periods where you're writing nothing, where you're just staring off into space. Not as much time passes as you might think. And it's a
Hmm.
very different rhythm with your sentences, with your language, with the imagery that comes into your mind when it's just pen and paper. So, what I do right now is I write by hand on weekdays, and then I type everything up on the weekend. So, I actually shift gears a little bit with my creative process all week long. And I just find that the handwriting is fruitful. It's interesting, and it works my brain and the way I deal with narrative in a slightly different way.
Hmm. Okay. So, was there anything that particularly surprised you while you were writing then? Something maybe that you didn't quite map out but appeared there on the page?
Not so much a particular image as the story itself really changed quite a bit.
Hmm.
When I had an early draft of this novel, I was trying to write like some kind of Lolita or Pale Fire or something, very, very serious, very smart. And so the book originally split the 2 years, roughly 1994 and 2008, into equal halves. And
Hmm.
Owen, who is the protagonist of this novel, was much more of a villain's probably a harsh word, but an anti-hero. And he dramatically shifted who he was as a character from part one to part two. And I found that my writer friends that would read this novel for me really responded to part one and not so much to part two. And so this process of revision, of writing by hand, of thinking through this creative process really shifted the way that this book ended up sounding in rhythm and tone, and ultimately time as well. So For readers of this book, about 90%, maybe 95% of this novel takes place in the 1990s when Owen is still in school, and only the last chapter or two take place in what's Owen's present day, which is approximately 2007, 2008.
Yeah, that's something I definitely was caught wind of, was surprised by. So I think maybe speak to how throughout the book, though, you allude to the future being something that we might reach to at some point, because Owen himself is kind of narrating the book and taking us through the events from the future. So it seems like you sort of dropped that other half, but you kept certain elements of it as the book progressed. So how did that take shape?
Yeah, that was a suggestion from a writer friend, and I'm going to name drop her because she's a fantastic writer named Rachel Swearnigan.
Mm-hmm.
And we met a couple years ago, and she offered to read this draft when it was done, and I sent it off to her, draft 5, 6, something like that. And she reminded me that this is a story about Owen surviving it. So the book is in first person. So Owen is telling his story from the point of all these events having concluded for him. Though as a reader, you're experiencing it in so-called real time. And
Mm-hmm.
so Rachel's suggestion to me was to occasionally remind the reader of Owen as the adult, Owen the person telling the story, Owen as survivor, which adds some narrative tension to the book because you get these little reminders now and again that something bad is happening, that there's some big event forthcoming in this book. And I think that makes for a tense and interesting read and keeps somebody engaged with the book. If this story had been entirely in present tense, I think it would really lack something. I think great first person stories always have a quality not only of confession, but of justification. And you want to hear that in Owen's voice, even if he never explicitly states it. And remembering to tell the story from where Owen is in the here and now as the survivor of these events was really important to me.
Mm. Yeah, that is interesting. I think that now that you say that out loud, that definitely helped me to understand what was going on from that perspective. One of the other things I noticed was that you did a really great job of world building. The book is really full of specific details. I've never been to Cincinnati. I've never been to Ohio at all. But at least I feel like I have some sense of some of the neighborhoods there, some of what it was like there, and you have even very very specific details like the hat Caitlin wears, or various brands of soda or crackers people are eating or drinking. I'm just curious to find out a little bit about where you drew inspiration for all that minutia of daily life.
Yeah, and first of all, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. Getting the details right of place is something that has always struck me as being very subtle. You want to get the right word, the right image, the right tone in, but you don't want to beat the reader over the head with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes back to, one of the reasons why you write by hand, because if you're on the laptop and you can look it up, all of a sudden you're Googling all kinds of images from the early 90s and trying to make sure that you have it just right. So I wanted to make sure that there were the small details in this book that would, kind of ripple out in the reader's mind. Whether it's when overalls or farmers, as they were called here in Ohio, were very popular, baggy clothes, pleats, those things that are very vivid to me because that's when I was in high school and junior high. And for better or worse, I think those years are very formative for us and very difficult for us to forget. And so I had to look up a couple of details like what movies were in theaters in a particular year, or if an album was actually released at a particular point. But it was more getting the sense of it right. It wasn't necessarily important that Dr. Dre's The Chronic had come out. You can pick any other album to mention to the reader, but that I wanted to have that sense for the reader that these are a couple of boys playing gangster, white suburban kids taking on a persona, and to acknowledge that they were listening to G-funk music, that the bass was thumping in their cars, that they had cars that thump thump thump, that kind of stuff that suburban boys do. But also some details that are very particular to place. One of the things that I thought really stood out to me is the fact that in Rockcastle, the doors of the classrooms swung out into the hallway rather than into the classrooms. It's a small thing, but it's peculiar. I also
Mm-hmm.
thought it was correct, and it gave just that little bit of wrinkle of authenticity to the narrative that I thought really helped to make Owen's world vivid.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and I think, like I said, it not only helped to make Owen's world vivid, but it helped to make it vivid in our imaginations. Okay, well let's talk about the book. This is there's a lot to talk about as we were discussing right before we started, but I think let's really set the stage because there aren't a ton of characters in the book. I mean, the book is really focused in on just a couple, and Owen Webb and Carson Bly. Owen and Carson are sort of our two main characters. So maybe let's just start with them to give everybody a picture. So who are Owen and Carson?
So Owen Webb is the main character in this book. He's approximately 14 years old. He's a freshman. He's pugnacious. He comes to the opening of the book, I think, with some sense of that anger that's percolating in the family. When parents divorce, when a marriage falls apart, it's something that's, I think, building over a long period of time. So when we first open up the book and experience Owen's world, I think that sense of being a fighter is there. In chapter one, he's kind of cursing and muttering at Carson's instruction. He feels a sense of anger and displacement. He doesn't quite fit in at Rockcastle. He's wearing clothes that don't quite fit right. He's aware of these differences, and as a teenage boy, there's that sense of uh, trying to figure out who you are and really being defined by other people still. You just don't have a very strong sense of self. I think that's something that anybody that's ever been a teenager, which is most adults, could certainly relate to. Carson is older. Carson's a junior at this school. Carson comes from a wealthy family. The Blys are fifth generation Rockcastle attendees. His father works in commercial real estate, develops mortuaries. He says in one of the chapters in the book that his trade is death. Um, and it's a family that I think we'd recognize some of the sense of entitlement, of wealth that has been passed on, a really strong sense of owning the world and not having to answer to anybody. Carson's a handsome boy. Both boys are athletic. Both boys have a sense of anger and frustration, which doesn't necessarily come from a particular source. I didn't want either of these characters to have a very specific trauma you could point to and have them figured out. I think characters that have a sense of mystery, of uncertainty, without necessarily being clearly defined as having a source, are really intriguing to me because you're trying to figure them out as you're reading through the book. So they are both um, foils in this book. They're also kind of, in Owen's mind, I think in some ways Carson is kind of a hero. He's a bit of
Hmm.
apologetic about Carson, despite everything that happens in this book. And that sense of friendship and need is pretty strong throughout this book. I really wanted to write something about male friendship. I feel like I don't see a lot of books about that I think deal with male friendship in the type of with the type of depth and examination that I think it really deserves. And so having these two boys that could juxtapose each other a little bit and show a contrast, I thought was would make for a compelling read.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what happened. I mean, you really take the time at the beginning of the book to build up the extremes between the two boys. Describing Carson as blue blood, I think, and not only was Owen kind of the lonely boy by the window, but I feel like he didn't even know what blue blood was, the term. It's just he's just such a different person from such a different world. But what was interesting to me during the course of the book was how there was such a trajectory where the boys didn't know each other, they became very close friends, and then they kind of separate a bit, and then they get reunited, and so there's kind of, it comes and goes, and by the time they're reunited, they've kind of ultimately led very separate lives, despite the fact that during kind of the height of their friendship, it felt like they were inseparable, and this was going to be it. And Owen was saying things like, oh, they would be talking in decades about how they were, there together during that one night at, Carson's house or whatever. So I found that trajectory really interesting. How do you feel like that trajectory is sort of similar or different to what, we might experience with our own childhood friends. Was this a really unique situation, or is this kind of more common?
I hope it's unique.
Hmm.
We have our friendships are strange, right? There's the people that we know that we're new friends with, people we've met in the last year or two. Our job, a relationship, a marriage are ways that people come into our lives, or if we move around. I've moved and lived in a wide range of cities: Boston, St. Louis, Columbia, Missouri, Washington D.C., and now here in my home in Columbus, Ohio. And it's unusual to me how some of those friendships that I make in each of those cities have sustained and even strengthened over time, and others have just faded away.
Hmm.
Sometimes friendships just wear out like tires on a car. There's just a certain amount of mileage on them, and then they're over. Or you both change as you grow up and you split apart. And then there's those friendships that you develop in high school, junior high, and maybe even back to grade school that endure. And perhaps it's because you two are similar people at whatever age, 25, 45, 65. Maybe it's some sense of loyalty to the self you used to be. It's strange how that works. From moving around quite a bit, my wife and I have had to actively work to make new friends. And once you graduate school, there's not the social pressure of high school or college, or I guess maybe not pressure, but the opportunity that
Hmm.
your education provides for you to make friends. You have to actively pursue it. And so we often romanticize those relationships from when we were younger. And I think Owens does that in this book. I think he looks at Carson with a sense that this is something maybe more powerful or magical than it really is. At the same time, I think he recognizes something in Carson that's very similar, despite their very different backgrounds. That sense of anger, that sense of loneliness, and they handle it very different ways. Owen accepts it. Embrace is probably not the right word, but he's a little bit more conscious of it, while Carson's sense of entitlement really drives that anger in him. And yet, that sense of what they get from basketball, from athletics, from team sports, from being defiant, really helps to unite them, and something that stays with them, long after the story's over.
Yeah, that's interesting. You raised lots of things there. I think one of the things you raised was that the friendship, it seemed close. Even at its closest moments, it still seemed a bit uneven, if that makes sense. And that, yeah, like you were saying, Carson really kind of manipulated the situation throughout the book, and definitely with the friendship between the two. And it felt like, Owen maybe knew this a bit, but really had a hard time figuring this out. I mean, I think it's really not until the end of the book when he really realizes that, this was he was being manipulated the whole time. Whereas, almost everyone else seemed to kind of understand this at some level. His mom mentioned that, and Carson's sister Caitlin mentioned that. I think maybe even their basketball coach mentioned that. Carson really wasn't a good person. Uh, why was Owen so confused the whole time? Why did it take him so long to figure this out?
Both boys are competitive. I would say they're even hyper competitive.
Mm-hmm.
And competitors tend to be ego driven, and they also have very thin skin, but act as if their skin is quite thick, that they can take the criticism. There's a saying in sports that the good players can shake off a bad game and just come back the next day and everything's fine. But I think the great ones never forget, and they take every slight very personally. If you don't have sports, if you don't have that outlet in basketball, where does that competition come from them? Um, and it bleeds out into their lives quite literally in this book. Um, I think Owen's blind to it because he admires Carson, and I think he
Mm-hmm.
admires that competitive drive, that cutthroat quality, without realizing how dangerous it is. Um, I don't think he knows how close to the edge Carson's capable of bringing him. And I think Owen never knows whether or not he wants to fully cross that line. And I think that's what keeps this book tense. That recognition of the worst part of yourself, and rather than turning away from it, wanting to get a little bit closer to it. And I hope that what I'm able to show in this book is the way that can happen. We always think of the villains in stories, movies, the news as being an other from us. We're not like them. They're separate. They're evil, as opposed to recognizing how close we are to being just like them. And that's something that I wanted to try to explore by having Owen kind of willfully manipulated. I think he's conscious of Carson pulling some of those strings on him and willing to pretend that there are no strings, that he's doing this all on his own. And I think that that quality of darkness is what makes the story work, or at least I hope it does.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, Owen was such an interesting character. I mean, I think it really seems like he had a hard time just with everything. He's one of those characters where it's just like, just disaster after disaster after crazy thing gets thrown at him. But even within himself, he just felt very different. I remember that moment when we went to his kind of first party. He got drunk for the first time. He was sort of experiencing this new world that Carson brought him into. And I really like this line, where he said, even drunk, I recognize such happiness, however momentary, as elusive to me. I never possessed the ability to immerse myself in the reckless abandon of play. And I think that's a really well-defined sentence in terms of defining who he is and what's affecting him as he goes throughout the book. So, what was it that really made him unable to find this happiness? Was this related to his family? Was this kind of an intrinsic thing? I mean, why was it so difficult for him to just have fun like most of the other kids?
I always felt that it was intrinsic to Owen, that
Mm-hmm.
happiness was a quality he just didn't possess. I think we have all met people that have an emotional level that they never really escape from. People that are always sad, not necessarily depressive, not necessarily a medical condition, but they're just a little sad, or they're wound a little tight, they're a little too angry. And Owen recognizes his lack of happiness. I think he recognizes it early on, though he doesn't have words to define it as a 14-year-old boy. I think a lot of people can relate to that quality of being able to step outside yourself. I know that a character like Owen is always going to feel most lonely at a party rather than by himself. Surrounded by other people is when he feels most like he doesn't belong. When he most feels when he's looking around a room like the scene at the party, or looking around the grandstands at one of his games, that he's completely separate from everybody else. It's like he's digested existentialism without knowing what it is. And rather than finding that sense of that quality being freeing for him, instead it fills him with a certain amount of dread. And he does whatever he can to try to punch his way out of it, whether it's burying himself in his studies, because he's a bright student, he's a bright boy. I mean, I don't think Owen is a fool by any means. But again, that quality of being a teenager, it's all kind of firing through at the same time. Friendship, your sexuality, your studies, your family, and you don't yet have any sense of control over who you are, what you want to be. And that leads him into some dark places. But I think it really does come down to this is who he is as a character, and I hope the book explores that this is a character that just can't quite find happiness, and probably never entirely will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree, and that's part of what makes it so interesting. And I think, and you just mentioned this, that he is very smart and perceptive, and that comes out in different and interesting ways. One thing that I thought was just an interesting aside was, he seemed to have mastered, or on his way to mastering, silence. And, you wrote, or he spoke about, in the last 3 months, I discovered what a powerful and interesting effect silence had on people, and was beginning to enjoy the discomfort it created. So, So not only was he learning to use silence, he was enjoying the discomfort that it created in other people. So, he's kind of on his way to manipulating people and kind of maybe even following in Carson's footsteps. I mean, why was he so good at that? And I think in general, why was he right? Why is it that we as humans have problems with silence and kind of crave noise?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation and a tough question. One of the challenges of writing a book in the first person is that your main character has to be intelligent enough and interesting enough to tell his or her story.
Hmm.
You just can't get into a story that's in the first person when the character is incapable of telling his or her own story. So I think good first person stories are always going to have a main character who is, in whatever way, whether it's an educated intelligence or a savvy intelligence learned from a hard-scrabble childhood, there's going to be an intelligence there. And to show this contrast between these characters, I wanted to show the way Owen can be aggressive and assertive in a way different from Carson. I think
Mm-hmm.
the book would get melodramatic and maudlin if it was always, a fist fight or gun violence. If it was always something straight out of a Hallmark movie or a Bruce Willis movie or something like that.
Yeah.
So using silence is something that I think is a technique that's really useful, not just for Owen as a character, but as a writer. One of the things we can do with a book that you can't really show in film and television is interiority, and the way that I can contrast Owen as a person by showing what it's like going into his head and then making that feel a little bit darker for you as a reader. Like, this is how I use silence as a weapon.
Hmm.
And it's true. People don't like silence. We pull out our phones and start tapping away whenever we're standing in line. We drum our fingers. We tap our feet. We get very impatient. And I think it's from a lack of comfort with ourselves. And I don't think that's necessarily a character flaw of us as human beings, just that's the society that we live in. And Owen's a type of person that is observant, perhaps judgmental. Again, that's why he makes for a good narrator of this story. And so a weapon like silence, I think, makes him both very similar to Carson and very different at the same time. And I think that's the
Hmm.
kind of difference between the boys that Owen would be proud of, which is one of the reasons I think he reveals it to the reader.
Hmm. Fair enough. Uh, so I want to start talking a bit about the bigger, maybe themes within the book, and one of those is secrets. And the book deals with secrets in many ways, and you kind of already mentioned at the beginning um, what happened with Owen's dad and your dad. But there's even just sort of little secrets scattered throughout the book, like Owen introduces Carson to his mom, and during that conversation, it comes out that Carson's mom has passed away, and Owen had no idea, and this is kind of shocking to him. And then we get to the bigger reveal about Owen's dad and that issue. I mean, to me, that those types of personal secrets are very interesting and make me think about the extent to which that we can really know anybody. So I was just curious about kind of how you felt Owen was affected by kind of the smaller secrets and finding those out, and then obviously the big secret about his dad, and then thinking about how we can really how we can go about getting to know somebody, knowing that there's always potentially one more secret that can drop, or that we're always a secret away from realizing that we didn't know them at all.
Yeah, secrets are great in fiction, aren't they?
Mm.
We love we love reading about things that we don't want to experience in our own life. I mean, if you were reading a book about a very happy group of people, you'd be bored immediately, even though we want our lives to be as, uneventful and untraumatic as we possibly can make them. It comes back to what you asked earlier about the details of getting the era right, getting the details right. there's no smartphones, there's no Google. You can't look up information when you have a story set in the 1990s. Owen had to be home to wait for a phone call. He has to check his answering machine to get messages and leave messages. And that gives you the opportunity for these characters to start imagining, well, what's going on? What's happening? Secrets are really great for getting a story going forward. Sometimes those secrets and the characters come from a place of discomfort, from embarrassment, not wanting to admit what they don't know or they're unaware of. Other times it's from protection. I think there's things that our parents don't tell us when we're children, when we're teenagers, even when we're adults, in the hope of protecting us from pain, from trauma. And all of these characters have to have rich interior lives in order to be vivid on the page. And there's going to be things that they hold back, things that they're not going to tell Owen, things that he's going to discover on his own. And that's one of the benefits of having the story in first person. As a narrator, he can only reveal what he knows. If he doesn't know it, if he doesn't discover it, it stays hidden. And I think that adds to a tension of the story that he's trying to tell. I think it adds to him trying to understand what's happening. In many ways, he's trying to puzzle out his own life. Yes, he has survived these events. Yes, he's gotten through it. What does it all mean to him? And I think as he's telling his story, he's trying to figure that out. And having these small reveals come out as the book goes forward, I hope keeps people reading and keeps Owen puzzling over his own life story.
Mm. So, kind of moving from secrets to then how are we dealing with them? Kind of once they're out there is something that the book also talks about, So there's this big reveal with Owen's father, and, he ends up, going to jail, and Owen has to deal with this. But not only does Owen have to personally kind of deal with this, it's all a matter of public record. Owen's father was taken away, and everybody knows what's going on. It's in all the papers. I mean, it's kind of the talk of the town for a couple of days. It was in the news. But when Owen goes back to school after this happened, it wasn't really mentioned, and kind of it seems like it was sort of kept out of the public. Wasn't the teachers weren't mentioning it to Owen in class or anything. But it was, as you mentioned in the book, kind of freely discussed elsewhere, maybe in more closed door situations. And I think this is, you really hit spot on the way that we deal with things like this. Gossip is so intrinsic, I think, to our nature. It's just so interesting. I mean, I was curious if you had any thoughts about why that was. I mean, we're trying to, be nice to people on the one hand, but on the other hand, we're, kind of fanning the flames and doing things that are to some degree counterproductive. I mean, why does that keep happening?
We always love gossip, right? I mean,
Yeah.
As long as there's been civilization, we love talking about other people, whether it's our neighbors or the king and the queen and what's going on in the royal court. And I thought, I've always thought that it's interesting the way different classes talk about each other, things that are not considered polite. Being told as a Midwesterner not to make a scene. You don't talk about yourself. You don't brag. And the way that different people in different socioeconomic statuses are going to deal with something like Owen's father being arrested. When he's at home, he's got to talk about it with his mother. They've got to figure out what to do. And of course, among his friends, it comes up, what are you going to do? How are you going to survive? What's going to happen? But when he's back in the halls of a school, it's a stiff upper lip. We don't talk about those things. It's uncouth to talk about those things. And so I think that it helps to showcase, without hopefully being too overt about it, the difference between how we talk about the traumas in our lives, airing our dirty laundry or not doing so, and what kind of damage that can do to you psychologically. You've mentioned that Carson has never told Owen about his mother's death, and in the book, it's revealed fairly early on that Carson's mother had died from an aneurysm. That kind of suffering, those kind of injuries, that's not discussed among other people. And while Carson tries to make the point to Owen, well, hey, look, this happened a long time ago. Everybody knows this. I think he's lying there. He's very conscious of the fact that he doesn't tell Owen this, and I think Owen knows it as well. Um, and and what I hope to show among these boys and among these different classes in the book is the way those tensions are constantly under the surface. They're trying to ram through, but they never quite crack the surface. And that tension and that kind of disappointment in the way that we treat our friends and neighbors is one of the things that I think helps to make Owen's story sad and hopefully memorable. That quality of never being able to fully connect with other people, that sense that he's always kind of a, if not unhappy, certainly a person that can't quite be happy as a human being.
Hmm. Yeah, and to further add to the unhappiness and what I mentioned earlier, when you sort of, it's really piled on to poor Owen here. There's just a ton of family issues, right? The fractured family relationships and negative family dynamics are a big part of the book, in both of the families, but definitely most prominently in Owen's family, where there we see the parents fighting constantly, even at the beginning, and Owen fighting with various parents. Owen's grandfather comes at one point in the book, and Owen ends the discussion by hitting him and running away, and it's just constant crisis with family. And I don't know if everyone quite has that level of disaster affect them, but we all have trouble with family relationships from time to time. And so I was just curious to know, first off, were the families in the book kind of doomed from the start? Was there nothing that could have saved them? And in general, could how can we work to cultivate better relationships in our family, or is that just something we have to deal with what we have and kind of, I guess, tread water on almost?
Yeah, and it's fascinating because when you lay it out, one of my first thoughts is that I never thought of or wrote Owen as a victim. You're
Mm,
right. A lot of terrible things happen to him, but also a lot of good things. I mean, he does
sure.
get into a good school. He does excel at basketball. He does survive his parents' divorce and his father's arrest. There still are choices to be made as a character, as a person, and thinking about the various drafts that this book went through, Owen was a very different person in some of these early drafts. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but he was really closer to an anti-hero, much more wicked feels like a strong word, but I'll run with it. A more wicked, a more manipulative, a more Carson-like figure in earlier drafts of this book. And so I think whether it's entirely on my own, or I think writers would understand this, something where the character reveals himself to you, or the character kind of has his own agency. That's not the direction that Owen goes. And, thinking about it as we're talking here, I'm thinking like, boy, this sounds like the bleakest novel ever written. This sounds like everybody's miserable by the end of this thing. And it's not, I
There's
don't
hope.
think
There's
there's
hope.
hope. There's definitely
Yeah.
hope. But I also wouldn't call it happy. I mean, in some ways, the book
Hmm.
reflects Owen's character perfectly, right? I mean, it's hopeful, but it's not happy. There's opportunity, but you're still kind of in the mud at the end of this one. Um, and I think there are always going to be opportunities in really good books where you can point very specifically to a moment where a character has made a poor decision, a bad decision, perhaps with good information, perhaps with the wrong information. But that's what keeps us turning, right? We're like, oh my goodness, I hope it doesn't go this way, right? You kind of hope for, things turning out a little bit better than they ultimately do for the character. Um, so yeah, I think Owen has opportunities here. He has chances here. I don't think he necessarily had to have turned out this way. Um, but for what this book's thematically interested in, for the way I want this book to be taken on the whole, I would say that character's destiny here.
Mm. Well, okay. I want to get to something that is throughout the permeates the book, which is basketball. And we've kind of alluded to it here and there. Basketball is maybe the one sport that I would argue I kind of understand. So I was excited that was the sport that was pretty much focused throughout the book. It was the sport. It was my dad. I grew up in LA. My dad would take me to Laker games when we were growing up, when I was growing up in the 90s. So kind of the one sport, at least I somewhat understand. So good that I was here. And, first off, I think you did an incredible job of kind of giving a very detailed description of what it was like. I've never, I play basketball from time to time, but never at that level. And you could really get a sense of what it was like being on a team that was being competitive and fighting, and how different players felt really affected the game. When Carson was in the mood to really perform, he did, or when he wasn't, versus when Owen was really out there and to fight. And it was just really fascinating to me. And especially in the way that basketball, and you kind of alluded to this, was almost like Owen's bedrock. And he plays basketball in many different places throughout the book. He plays at Rockcastle in the gym. He plays pickup games at Carson's place. It's sort of just, it's always kind of there in the background, and then all of a sudden, it might launch into a game, launch into just shooting hoops, whether to clear his mind or remind us what, like you said, what Owen's good at. So, I was just curious, do you have activities that are like that for you? And, is that something that is important for us to do? And how can we kind of cultivate those things as we're getting older?
Boy, I've got so many things to follow up on there. As a
Yeah.
lifelong Celtics fan, I
Uh-oh.
am willing to continue this conversation, even though you admitted to being a Lakers fan.
Yikes.
And
Yikes.
I love basketball. It's my favorite game. I was until very recently a very active pickup basketball player, but I broke my leg playing
Oh,
back in
no.
September. Yeah, pretty bad injury. I broke the bone right beneath my knee. So I've got a 9 to 12 month recovery. I'm
Oh,
walking now,
boy.
but limping
Okay.
quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh
That's
no,
no fun.
yeah, no, it's okay. That's a whole that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But thank you. Yeah, I'm okay. But I do have titanium in my leg permanently now. Um,
Okay. Superman.
it's
Sorry.
super short more than anything. Um, but the thing that really fit about basketball in this book is something that you kind of mentioned there, is that you can practice the game on your own. So
Mm.
for writing fiction, you can put a character by his or herself, dribbling a basketball, shooting. You don't need other people around. And yet basketball also has a culture of 2-on-2, 3-on-3 games, full court games. It can be a team game. And one of the things that was a challenge when writing this book was to not focus so much on the exciting plays that you would see on television, or even reading sports books, or typical sports novels where it's all about who wins the big game or who hits the big shot. I really wanted to avoid those things in this book. So I wanted to focus on things like defensive stops, on shooting free throws, that quality of being able to look back on athletic activities and tell the story a little bit differently. Anybody that's a fan of sports and reads about the game online or gets newspapers and magazines still, it's kind of, here's what happened in the game, and then quotes, from the locker room. Athletes aren't that interesting. They don't tend to say anything very compelling. And game action, you can kind of get it from reading a box score, or frankly, you'd rather watch it on television.
Mm.
So it's a real challenge to get something down in fiction that is going to be engaging to a reader when talking about athletics. Um, but I think it's something that a lot of writers enjoy, is having some kind of an outlet. There's a whole bunch of writers who are really big into running. I think it's a
Mm.
way of getting away from the desk or out of the classroom or away from your job and not thinking. I recently read a terrific book called Deep Work by Cal Newport, which is about trying to do something cognitively difficult by really focusing. But there's only a certain amount of time you can do that. 4 or 5 hours, maybe six at the max, and then you have to step away and work out problems in your mind, maybe on an unconscious level. And I think writers, artists, any creative types really need some kind of an outlet besides the work. And for a lot of writers, it's running. For me, until recently, it was basketball.
Mm. Fair enough. Well, again, I wish you a speedy recovery.
Thanks.
That must be incredibly frustrating if that's what you did
It was not.
forever and ever.
Yeah, it
Really?
was
Oh,
not
good for
fun.
you. Oh, it's not fun. Okay, I thought you were saying it wasn't frustrating. Yeah, I can imagine.
Well, I mean, I love the game, but the injury was pretty bad. I was
Yeah.
non-weight bearing for 12 weeks, and
Mm.
yeah, so crutches. Not not a good time, but I'm stubborn. My wife wants me to take up swimming, but I'm convinced that I'll be able to play basketball again at some point this year. We'll see which one of us ends up being right.
Yeah. Well, you could do both and
I
claim
could do both.
victory twice. There you go. Okay. Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the end here. Uh, so once the book gets into the latter half, last third, Owen's dad is in prison, and all sorts of other stuff starts to happen. But Owen starts to ponder. Once he gets past the shock of what this, I didn't really know this person. He really starts to ponder why his father didn't really ever try and justify what happened. They had all these sort of very awkward conversations after it came out, and right before his father went to jail. He kind of took him to school, and it was all very weird. And his dad never really he never really was clear about what was happening, and didn't try to explain why he did what he did. And Owen thought about this for a bit, and it made me think about it too. And I was sort of like, wow, well, if Owen's father had justified or tried to explain it or something, would that have made it less bad? Would somehow an attempt at a justification, even if it maybe wasn't good, is that important to us if we find out something from a family member like that? And in this particular case, do you think it would have made it better for Owen?
Probably.
Yeah.
That was a tough scene to write when his father takes him to school that last time before sentencing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I hope that an astute reader catches on to how, in many ways, similar Owen's father and Carson are. That they're men that do not apologize, that have a lot of bravado, a lot of anger, um, fake it till you make it kind of an attitude. For one person coming from a moneyed, storied family, you can get away with that. For somebody else living a double life who gets caught, you can't. And I think there's something unsettling for Owen about how similar his father is to his friend. Something that I don't think he explicitly acknowledges in the book. I wanted that to be an undercurrent.
Mm-hmm.
There's really two storylines that drive this book. The first one is Owen and Carson. I would say that's the primary thing. This idea of male friendship. The second thing is the family, and the way that his parents fail him as he's trying to get through his teenage years, and how his father disappoints him, and without giving him too much of the ending away, how his mother's there for him when he needs her.
Mm-hmm.
His mother is a close ally in this book, despite not having a lot of scenes. I think those moments between Owen and his mother throughout this book are awfully tender. She's at his games. She comes down with the flu. He brings her dinner. After the arrest, it's just Owen and his mother at home. How they both have to fight to get through this, through the embarrassment, finding work, all those things that help to unite or fracture a family when a trauma like this happens. So yeah, I think if Owen's father had been a different sort of person, Owen would have a very different story to tell. But the fact that he isn't that man, the fact that Owen, perhaps subconsciously, in the years where this book is happening, subconsciously very similar to a Carson, I think begins to shift those plates underneath Owen that are going to get him away from this really dangerous friendship as the moment of truth arrives towards the end of the book.
Yeah. And kind of trying to bring it all together here, there's almost that a theme of forgetting or ignoring problems, and maybe that's kind of what you were getting at there, is that you know Owen just realizes that his dad, that Carson, and all these other people are just bad influences. He really finally gets it, and the light bulb goes off, and he's like, whoa, what's going on? And, he plays basketball to forget his problems and throughout the book. And, like we mentioned before, the school ignores what kind of was going on with his dad by not discussing it in public. At the end of the book, there's kind of a crazy crime that Carson ends up committing, and it seems like people move on. And even when we're kind of brought forth to the present, even Owen seems to have moved on from what Carson did. And I think a lot of that is people kind of deciding that it's easier to ignore or forget about the problems than kind of talking through them. Let me know if I missed that. It seems to me kind of a message that you're trying to get across, or a theme that you're trying to get across. And if that's so, I mean, why do you think that is?
Yeah, I don't think I have any answers to that, and I don't think the
Yeah.
novel. I don't think the novel suggests there is an answer, but I do hope. I do hope that it's raising those questions that you're asking. What can we ignore? Um, does time really heal wounds? Um, yeah, just closing your eyes to something doesn't make it go away. What happens when you don't have family, when you don't have bonds, when those friendships and those relationships fracture? What do you have to fall back on? Um, a- and for Owen, he's still trying to figure that out. I think telling this story is a way of understanding his life, is a way of understanding who he's become, how he got to this point, what things he's ignored, the way memory has shaped this story. I think anybody listening, if they think back on this past weekend, they can remember things quite clearly. But you think back a month, a year, 5 years, what do you remember and why? What things are very clear to you and what aren't? And as you're trying to remember those things in the here and now, you start shaping it to fit your current situation. We kind of manipulate ourselves all the time. It's just how our brain works. And so for Owen telling this story, for Owen confessing this story, I think it's his way of working out a lot of those questions that you're raising. How does this happen? Why does this happen? Um, if I had said something, would it have been different? If Carson had said something, my father, my mother, could this possibly have been otherwise? And I think that's part of the tragedy of the book. Asking yourself, could it have been differently, or is this the way it had to have been? As a piece of fiction, of course, the book is what it is. But I think you often are going to shake your head as you're reading this book and thinking, like, if somebody had spoken up here, if somebody had stepped in here, things really could have been different for these boys.
Yeah, totally. The what ifs really get you.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you mentioned briefly how what happened to Owen's father was similar to what happened to you in real life. Were there any other similarities or kind of autobiographical parts of the book that you were able to draw from your own life experiences for?
That's the primary one.
Mm-hmm.
The school itself, Rockcastle, is based on a school that I went to called Seven Hills, which is also the inspiration, I believe, for Curtis Sittenfeld's recent novel that is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice. I don't recall the name of her book off the top of my head. So some of those details of Rockcastle are correct, but I also made the school a little bit nicer in the here and now than it was then. But primarily, I'd say the autobiography of this book primarily comes from my father and Owen's father. The rest of it are all things that are imagined for the sake of telling a good story. Um, I don't find my personal story all that interesting, strange as it may sound. I feel like, yeah, I just don't find it all that compelling as, a memoir or biography or something like that. And fiction allows you to make stories dynamic. Things break,
Mm-hmm.
things happen. Um, and so in order to tell a story that I think that was interested in looking at some of the themes that you and I have talked about today, I had to, make quite a bit of it up. So all kinds of things that happen in this book are wholly fictitious. Probably the bulk of the book. If I went
Right.
through it with a fine tooth comb, I don't know, 21% autobiographical. I'm honestly not sure, but
Okay. No, you don't have to give a number. It's okay.
21%. I'm going to go with 21%.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's a basketball statistic. I feel like it's impressive. Okay. Well, um, Yeah, let's see. What else? We've talked a lot about kind of very specific things happening in the book, bigger themes. Is there anything else that you hope people will get out of this book that we haven't covered yet? Any lessons, ideas, concepts, emotions?
At the most simple level, I hope readers are engaged and entertained. I hope they
Mm.
find Owen's story fascinating. I hope that they hope the best for him. I hope that they are wrapped up in his story. Thematically, I think we've talked about the big things: male friendship, cultures of violence, class structures, and how they separate and compartmentalize people. Um, I'd say those are the three biggest things that thematically I want people to take away and think about as they're reading this book, and hopefully long after the book's over. Um, and I hope to continue approaching some of those subjects with my next book. There are things that have always kind of fascinated me.
So you slightly brought it up, but what's next for you? What are you working on?
I am going to continue the writer tradition of saying as little as possible about the
Aha,
work in progress. I have
excellent.
started a new novel. I have been writing the first draft by hand. It's coming along. I'm not sure what I have. That that
Yeah.
that's very similar actually with All the Castles Burned. The challenge of a book that's in first person like this novel is that you have to get to the end to kind of know what you're writing.
Mm.
I couldn't really go back and work on early chapters about Owen until I knew where he ended up. With this book, I just want to write a different book than this one. I don't entirely know what that means because I think all writers have certain themes that they're interested in. But the challenge that I presented myself with this new novel is that it's in third person and it has multiple narrative strands. And trying
Mm.
to figure out how to bring those all together is a ongoing process that I have yet to unpack so far. So it's a good challenge. If you have me on a good week, I'd say it's going well. If you have me on a bad week, it's not. But that's just, the writer's life right there.
Yeah, and that's a great challenge, I think. Trying to weave together multiple narrative strands, because if a book can pull that off well, I mean, it's that's amazing to me. So I wish you the best of luck there.
Thank you. I certainly
Um,
am going to need it.
yeah. All right. Well, let's have a little. I like to do a little thunder round, just quick little fun questions, and then we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Let's do it.
All right. What is your favorite food and or drink?
Ooh. Favorite food? This is not very interesting. I do love a really good pepperoni pizza. I mean, at the most basic level, that's so
That's
American.
totally
Um,
acceptable.
but that is delicious. And then favorite drink's going to be a good bourbon. I'm not
Ooh.
a heavy drinker, but yeah, you get a good bourbon. I'm a very happy man.
Okay. Recommend one. I like bourbon too.
Um, uh, Bullet sounds like such a boring answer. I feel like
Hey, Bullet is good.
Angel's Envy is really terrific.
Angel's Envy.
Yeah,
Okay, I've never heard of
that's
that.
oh, that's a really
That's
good
good.
one. Yeah,
Okay, there you go. Thank you.
you're welcome.
I'll toast to you next time I have some. Where is your favorite place you've ever been?
Ireland. That was a long pause. Ireland. I spent a summer abroad in Galway, Ireland, which is on the west
Mm.
coast of the island. Beautiful there. Spent 6 weeks there studying history and literature. A wonderful place. There's a small river that runs through the town. Um, yeah, I would say Galway. With it, yeah,
It
Galway
sounds
definitely.
sounds beautiful. I've
Oh,
never
it's
been, but
fantastic. Yeah, it's also very
yeah.
cheap to fly to Paris from Galway. It's like
Mm.
99 pounds or something like that. And it's crazy because you think, oh, it's Paris, it's Europe. But when it's just across the channel, yeah, piece of cake.
Yeah. Once you get to Europe, everything is very close. This is what
Right?
I
Yeah.
realize. It's just the getting there, the transatlantic part that's tricky. All right, well let's finish it up with one of my favorite questions, which is if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Well, the instant answer that pops in my head is who won the 2016 presidential election. That's probably an answer
It's
that almost
valid.
any right. Yeah, I mean that's probably the obvious thing. Yeah, I'm going to stick with that. Not to get
Okay,
too political on your podcast, but I think that's a pretty good answer.
totally allowed. It's your magic wand. All right. On that note, Thank you so much, Michael, for being on the show. The book is All the Castles Burned by Michael Nye. In case you haven't figured out, it is an outstanding book. I really, really enjoyed it. It's very fun to read, and go out and buy it. I mean, it's out tomorrow. I mean, Valentine's Day is coming up. Get going here, everybody. All right. Thanks a bunch, Michael.
You're very welcome, John. Great to talk to you, and thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.